What's up, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I'm diving into one of the most terrifying crime sprees in New York City history. What made Maxim Gelman snap? Was it the drugs, causing delusions and extreme paranoia? Was it rejection from Yelena Bolchenko that sent him over the edge? Or did it all start with a mother's concern about her son driving under dangerous conditions? How did this spiral into a desperate, disgusting killing spree that left multiple people dead and an entire city in fear? New York City is no stranger to crime, but on February 11th, 2011, the city witnessed something truly horrifying. A brutal, 28-hour rampage that spread across Brooklyn and Manhattan. His name was Maxim Gelman, but some knew him as Wes or Max. He was paranoid, violent, and out of control. What drove him to kill? Who was Maxim Gelman? Maxim Gelman, also known as Wes or Max, was a 23-year-old Ukrainian immigrant living in Brooklyn, New York. Raised in a Russian-speaking community, he spent much of his time in the Brighton Beach area. Gelman had a troubled past. He had been arrested for minor drug offenses and graffiti, but those incidents barely scratched the surface of his growing instability. He was deeply paranoid, often convinced that the world was conspiring against him. His paranoia seemed fueled by a dangerous combination of mental illness and heavy drug use, particularly PCP. Those who knew him described his behavior as erratic and unsettling. He obsessed over conspiracy theories, constantly speaking about government mind control, hidden plots, and secret messages only he could understand. As time went on, his mental state deteriorated further. He became increasingly volatile, lashing out unpredictably and acting on impulses that made little sense. His drug use only worsened his paranoia, making him feel invincible one moment and deeply persecuted the next. But nothing in his past hinted at the sheer brutality he was about to unleash. A&E conducted an interview with Maxim Gelman, where he proclaimed himself to be a mid-level drug dealer, claiming to have dealt substantial amounts of drugs. However, those who actually knew him painted a very different picture. They described him as nothing more than a low-life drug user, someone who was barely getting by and far from the criminal mastermind he pretended to be. Throughout the interview, Gelman seemed to gloat about his crimes, showing absolutely no remorse for his heinous actions. Watching him speak, it's disturbing to see how detached he was from reality. It really makes me wonder, how did this man perceive himself? Was he truly convinced that he was some kind of street king? Or was he so lost in his delusions that he had created a fictional version of himself, one that existed only in his own mind? And that raises an even bigger question. Is this how some people cope with their actions? Does creating a fantasy allow someone like Gelman to live with himself, avoiding the crushing weight of reality? Maybe, in his twisted mind, he needed to believe in this grand illusion of power and control to escape the truth, that he was nothing more than a paranoid, drug-addicted murderer. It all started on February 11th, 2011, around 5 a.m., when Maxim Gelman arrived at his mother's house, demanding his passport. He was convinced that the federal government was following him, and in his paranoid state, he believed he needed to flee to the Dominican Republic to evade capture. His mother, sensing something was off, suspected he was under the influence of drugs. As she tried to reason with him, tensions escalated when his stepfather, Alexander Kuznetsov, a 54-year-old Russian immigrant, confronted him. Gelman had always harbored strong resentment toward Kuznetsov, referring to him in derogatory terms during later interviews. In a sudden and violent outburst, Gelman grabbed a knife and launched a vicious attack, repeatedly stabbing his stepfather in a blind fury. The scene was chaotic and frenzied, fueled by paranoia, anger, and a fractured state of mind. His mother, shocked and horrified, immediately called 911. But Gelman had already fled the house, blood-stained and fueled by adrenaline. What followed was a 28-hour crime spree that would leave New York City gripped in fear and go down as one of the most chaotic rampages in the city's history. After fleeing the scene of his stepfather's murder, Gelman sped off in his 2004 silver Lexus, his mind spiraling into paranoia and rage. In his A&E interview, he later claimed that after killing his stepfather He believed he had nothing left to lose. Convinced that the feds were already after him for past drug arrests, according to him, it was now time to eliminate those who had ratted him out or wronged him. His next stop was just 4 blocks away, the home of Yelena Bolchenko, a 20-year-old aspiring nurse. While Gelman never directly explained how she had ratted on him, those who knew her told a different story. They claimed Gelman had been obsessed with Yelena for months, but she had rejected him repeatedly. Determined to find her, Gelman knocked on the door of the Bolchenko home. When Anna Bolchenko, Yelena's 56-year-old mother, answered, she recognized him. Not knowing the danger she was in, she let him inside. Once inside, Gelman immediately began questioning her about Yelena's whereabouts. His tone was aggressive, his paranoia on full display. Anna quickly became suspicious, realizing something was seriously wrong. Sensing danger, she tried to run from the house, but Gelman chased her down, forcing her toward the kitchen. In a desperate move, she tried to escape, but Gelman spotted a kitchen knife, grabbed it, and attacked. He stabbed her multiple times in a relentless assault, leaving her lifeless on the floor. But Gelman wasn't finished. After killing Anna, he left in his car and drove to Kings Highway in Brooklyn, just a few blocks away. His goal? To spot Yelena at her job and finish what he started. Unable to spot Yelena on the street, Gelman made one last attempt. He decided to return to her house, hoping to finally find her. At that same moment, Yelena had just arrived home, completely unaware of what had happened. As she stepped inside, she was met with a shocking and heartbreaking sight. Her mother lying motionless on the floor. Overwhelmed with panic, she immediately called 911 and rushed outside, waiting for help. Just as she stood there in distress, Gelman pulled up once again. As he approached her, a concerned neighbor, noticing her distress, stepped in to help. But Gelman, driven by rage and paranoia, quickly overpowered the neighbor and turned his attention to Yelena. In a brutal and relentless attack, Gelman stabbed her multiple times, ensuring she had no chance to escape. The violence was shocking to say the least, an attack so ferocious and excessive that it is too graphic to fully describe here, leaving bystanders horrified. Meanwhile, firefighters and paramedics were already on their way, responding to the earlier 911 call for Anna Bolchenko. A firefighter arriving at the scene spotted Gelman mid-attack and immediately gave chase, but Gelman jumped back into his Lexus and sped off, vanishing into the streets of Brooklyn. With 2 more victims left behind, his rampage was far from over. Immediately after fleeing Yelena's house, Gelman abandoned his Lexus in the middle of a Brooklyn street. Now desperate for another vehicle, he approached a nearby car, a Pontiac with a driver still inside. Gelman walked up to the window and knocked. When the driver hesitantly rolled it down, Gelman suddenly lunged through, waving his knife and screaming for the man to get out. Frozen in shock, the driver didn't react quickly enough, and that's when Gelman stabbed him twice in the stomach. With the man critically wounded, Gelman shoved him out of the car, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped off. The victim, left bleeding on the pavement, was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, barely clinging to life, but against the odds, he survived. In his A&E interview, Gelman downplayed the attack, claiming he just needed the car and that he didn't intend for the man to die, but he showed zero remorse, brushing it off as if it were nothing more than a simple inconvenience. The way he spoke about it, with such casual indifference, really makes you wonder, to Gelman, was a knife just another tool, as ordinary as an ATM card is to the rest of us? He took what he wanted, without hesitation, without emotion, and without any regard for the lives he was destroying, and his rampage was far from over. Almost immediately after stealing the car, Gelman continued his violent spree. As he sped through Brooklyn, he spotted 62-year-old pedestrian Stephen Tannenbaum near the intersection of Avenue R and East 24th Street. Without warning, Gelman swerved toward him, striking him with the stolen vehicle before fleeing the scene. He made no attempt to stop or check on the victim, showing complete disregard for what he had done. Emergency responders arrived quickly and rushed Tannenbaum to the hospital, but despite their efforts, he succumbed to his injuries and was pronounced dead shortly after. By this point, law enforcement had begun connecting the crimes, and the NYPD launched a citywide manhunt for Gelman. His face was plastered across news stations, and officers flooded the streets. I was actually in South Brooklyn at the time of these attacks, and I can tell you firsthand, the police presence that night was overwhelming. I remember being stopped twice while walking home from a friend's house, about 1.5 miles from my place. The first time, I was cutting through a park as a shortcut when officers stopped me, questioned me, and checked my ID. Even though I was just passing through, I was harassed and issued a summons for being in the park after dusk. About 10 minutes later, just a few blocks away, I was stopped again, this time by a different set of detectives who questioned me all over again. The entire area was on high alert, and anyone on the streets that night was a potential suspect in their eyes. According to Gelman himself, he hid out and slept in the stolen car overnight, but it's hard to believe that he remained completely undetected in a carjacked vehicle, especially in New York City, where law enforcement was actively searching for him. How did he avoid being spotted? That remains a mystery. By the time he woke up, the car wouldn't start, forcing him to ditch the vehicle and head underground. With nowhere else to go, he jumped on the subway, attempting to blend into the morning commute. As the train moved through a subway tunnel near Times Square, it suddenly came to a stop. Over the intercom, an announcement stated that service was halted due to a police investigation. Whether it was paranoia or sheer intuition, Gelman immediately sensed danger. He wasn't going to sit there and wait. He needed to get out. Without hesitation, he forced open the doors between subway cars, jumped down onto the tracks, and ran along the tunnel in a desperate bid to escape. As he moved through the dark tunnels, he grabbed onto a slow-moving train, managing to climb aboard undetected. Despite the massive citywide manhunt, Gelman evaded capture for hours, slipping through the cracks of one of the busiest cities in the world. But his last and most brazen attack was still to come, inside a crowded subway train during the morning rush. At 8:30 a.m. on February 12th, Gelman boarded a packed 3 train at Times Square, blending into the crowd. But he wasn't just sitting there. He had a plan. Gelman suddenly made his way to the conductor's booth, banging on the door multiple times. In a desperate attempt to evade capture, he shouted through the door, claiming he had official business and demanding they open up. His plan? To hijack the train and use it as his getaway. Unbeknownst to Gelman, a police officer was stationed inside the conductor's cabin. As the officer slightly opened the door to investigate, Gelman immediately swung his knife at him, missing by mere fractions of an inch. Realizing the danger, the officer quickly slammed the door shut, preventing Gelman from getting inside. Furious that his escape attempt had failed, Gelman turned in a fit of rage, scanning the train for his next victim. That's when his eyes landed on Joseph Lozito, a 41-year-old ticket agent and mixed martial arts fan who had been quietly sitting nearby. Without warning, Gelman lunged at Lozito, slashing him across the head and neck, but this time, his victim fought back. Despite being wounded and bleeding, Lozito tackled Gelman to the ground, using nothing but pure adrenaline and instinct to subdue him. As panicked passengers screamed, police officers stationed inside the conductor's cabin rushed in and finally arrested Gelman. After 28 hours of terror, Maxim Gelman was finally in custody. In court, Gelman showed no remorse. Instead, he smirked, laughed, and boasted about his crimes. His erratic behavior continued throughout the trial, frequently interrupting proceedings. At one point, he yelled out to the judge, saying, "Why don't you just give me the death penalty?" He also claimed the government had implanted a chip in his brain, rambling about conspiracy theories that only he seemed to understand. But the jury saw through his act. In 2012, Gelman was convicted of multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and other charges. He was sentenced to 200 years in prison, ensuring he would never walk free again. Let me know in the comments why you think Maxim Gelman went on this rampage. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone.